Right, so Alessandro with the University of Padua. I'm here to tell you about fair ranking and duplicates and their interaction. And this is joint work with colleagues from the University of Padua. Very quickly about myself, I come from the lovely town of Pordenone in northeastern Italy, which was recently put on the map by a army night drill gone terribly wrong. They actually hit a chicken barn with a tank. Luckily, no human casualties, but several casualties among the ranks of the chickens, which gave a lot of work to the meme machine. And this whole thing sort of reminded me of people building powerful technology, which then some other people start using whilst being somewhat in the dark about where they are aiming it and who's on the other side. But moving on to things that are more relevant for this audience, what is fair ranking and why do we care about it? Let us start from an example. This is a result page from Amazon for the query controller. And these are results ordered by the platform. And according to popular attention models, we know that exposure for items or attention given by users decreases steeply with rank. Whilst on the other side, if we consider the relevance for these items, and let us use ratings as a proxy for relevance, these are quite uniform. And so we run the risk of having items of similar relevance receiving extremely different attention. So as a community, we've come up with normative reasoning about this. For instance, equity of amortized attention says that, well, it's defined as follows. A sequence of rankings offers equity of amortized attention if each subject receives cumulative attention proportional to her cumulative relevance. But if looking on the right-hand side here, this is the granularity with which we can parcel out attention, there's not much we can do to have this distribution match this other distribution. However, a peculiar thing about ranking is that there's a task repetition. So very often the same system will have to attend the same information need multiple times. So the next time a query comes around, and this is often called the query impression. So the same query repeated multiple times. It's multiple impressions of the same query. So next impression, a simple thing we can do is just flipping this list. And if we now sum attention 1 and attention 2, then we start converging to a distribution which matches more closely the distribution for relevance. Okay, time for a spoiler. We find in this work that in a variety of settings, common fair ranking policies have a tendency to reward duplicates more than static policies which are solely focused on relevance. So we've come up with normative reasoning about this. And we think that multiple copies of an item deserve the same attention that the item would be entitled to on its own. So if it weren't duplicated, especially if the copies benefit the same provider. And why is that? Well, in essence, otherwise, item providers who duplicate their items would gain more exposure than providers who do not. System owners may have to deal with increased redundancy, and item consumers would be exposed to a manipulated variety of items, which can be especially problematic if items convey opinions. A bit of motivation about this. So going back to our example, do we actually encounter duplicates or near duplicates in the real world? Well, this is a real world example, and items in position 1 and 3, I'm going zero-based here. So this controller and this controller are what we would call near duplicates. They're essentially the same product, just different aesthetics, different price, but definitely the same producer would benefit from exposure of these items. Same thing can happen on Airbnb. So this is the same property in Shoreditch listed twice under different conditions. And just once more, for good measure, we can find mentions of this under a problematic framing in official forums for item providers on both Airbnb and Amazon. So it's something that happens, and there can be duplicates or near duplicates which are posted in accordance to platform policy. So it's not just a matter of removing them. They are there and we need to think about this. So time for our setting. We care about a ranking policy pi, which produces a sequence of rankings rho pi. And given this sequence of rankings, items, which we index by subscript I, are going to get a cumulative exposure AI, and they're going to have a cumulative relevance RI, which we then combine through a function f, which essentially encapsulates our normative reasoning about what we think is a reasonable exposure for this item given its relevance. And this we call fairness, and it's a construct for that's useful or meant to be useful for providers. And if you hear me say unfairness later on, I'll just mean the negative of this value. And then we also care about utility. This is something for consumers of items. So in information retrieval setting, typically we think about information gain. And these are two objectives potentially conflicting. So we trade them off through a parameter lambda, and we obtain an objective function, which we target explicitly with a greedy policy, which at every step, it's a stateful policy, which keeps track of the accumulated unfairness, so the accumulated exposure and relevance. And if an item received exposure that is too low compared against its relevance, then perhaps for the next impression, we will push it up the rankings a little bit to compensate for this. Next, we also concentrate on a placket loose based policy, which samples rankings stochastically based on the estimated relevance. So that we have, if we have an item that we think is super relevant, it's quite likely that it will be the topmost item, but it's not necessarily the case. And in this work, we consider a single query, multiple impressions of it, and different relevance profiles, and different costs of duplication. And we'll see in a moment what we mean by these, starting from relevance profiles. Here we have 3 different relevance profiles, considering 5 items that we want to rank. So in light blue here, we have small relevance differences. So we moving from the most relevant item to the least relevant item, the relevance is reduced by tiny amounts. So even the least relevant item is relevant has a relevance score of 0.8. On the contrary, on the other hand, we have large relevance differences in orange. So here, again, we start from 1, but by the time we get to the bottom, the relevance has gone down to 0. And then we have an intermediate setting with relevance equal to 0.125. For cost of duplication, well, we start from an item UI, and we have a relevance RI associated with it. And if we then duplicate this item, we call the duplicate UI tilde, and it's going to have a relevance RI tilde associated with it, proportional to the original relevance RI through a multiplicative constant K between 0 and 1, so that the relevance of a duplicate decreases. And this happens because, well, we model it this way because very often in platforms, relevance depends on user interactions with items. And if we have multiple copies of an item, then user interactions will be spread across all the copies. Hence, there will be a decrease. Right, so we're ready to have a look at our results. Here on the x-axis, we have the 5 items we just talked about. And on the y-axis, we have the cumulative exposure for these items over 100 impressions of the same query under a browsing model coming from expected reciprocal rank. And let us concentrate on the solid lines for now. In red, we have the exposure coming from a policy which is solely focused on relevance, so lambda equals 0. And in blue, we have one where we also focus on fairness. So lambda equals 0.5. And now we can start having a look at the dots. The dots represent the extra attention an item would get if it was duplicated, whilst remaining items are not. So it represents the sum AI plus AI tilde. This is U0 plus U0 tilde. And we find that across all items, if we have a look at the difference between the dot and the solid line, that's essentially the incentive for item duplication in that position under that ranking policy. And the incentive is larger consistently across all positions for the fairness-aware policy. And this holds true for small relevance differences, which we were looking into, but then we also consider intermediate relevance differences, large relevance differences across columns, whilst in rows, we vary the cost of duplication. Here, we essentially have a free copy in terms of relevance. And in the second row, we have a cost of duplication such that the relevance of the duplicate is halved. And again, across all these settings, we find that the blue policy provides larger incentives for item duplication than the red policy does. And we also consider a policy which is less focused on relevance, on fairness, sorry, but still aware of fairness. So lambda equals 0.2. And here we find that if the relevance of the duplicated item is halved in the bottom row, then here the incentives become smaller, which we expect. Now item duplication has become expensive. Duplicates cannot attain the same relevance of the original item, so there's not much of an incentive to duplicate them. But moving to the topmost row now, if item providers find a way to duplicate their items without sacrificing relevance, then again, the incentives are there and they are stronger for the fair ranking policy.
Alessandro, 2 minutes left, please.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we also consider the policy based on placket-loose sampling. And this graph is actually very similar to the one I showed in the previous slide. So again, across the board, so across different costs of duplication and across different relevance profiles and across different items in different positions of the ranking, the incentives are larger for item duplication. They are larger under the fair policy. So our conclusions are the following. Well, I spoiled them already, but repeating them for good measure. In a variety of settings, common fair ranking policies reward duplicates more than static policies solely focused on relevance. And we argue that this is problematic for three different reasons, which in essence mirror the three stakeholders we have in mind in ranking problems. So item providers who duplicate their items gain more exposure than providers who do not. And this seems unfair for the latter. Also, as a result of this incentive, then system owners may have to deal with increased redundancy. And finally, item consumers are exposed to a manipulated variety of items, which can be especially problematic in situations where items convey opinion. So that's it from me. I'm happy to take questions live or through email, and